Hello and welcome, I'm Fahd Husain. There is a moment unfolding in the Gulf tonight where conflict, diplomacy and energy politics are beginning to converge into one story. And that story is moving faster than many realize. The United States and Iran remain locked in a tense standoff with no clear breakthrough yet in sight. Tehran has suggested it could reopen the Strait of Hormuz, but only if pressure on it is eased, while Washington continues to maintain its position, signaling that any de-escalation will come on its own terms. So what we are seeing is not quite war, but it is certainly not peace either. And in that space in between, the global oil market has begun to shift in ways that could have long-term consequences. Oil prices have already reacted. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the most critical energy arteries in the world, remains constrained. And at points during this crisis, production itself has been affected not by choice, but simply by the inability to move oil out of the region. This is no longer just a geopolitical standoff. It is an energy shock unfolding in real time. And in the middle of that, this shock comes a development that could reshape the internal balance of power in the Gulf. The UAE has decided to leave OPEC. Now, in another moment, this might have been seen as a technical move. But in the current environment, it carries political weight. Because for decades, OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, has been the anchor of stability in global oil markets. When crisis hit, it was this leadership that stepped in to steady supply, to calm markets, and to prevent shocks from spiraling out of control. That stabilizing role matters even more in a moment like this. The UAE's decision, therefore, is not just about production levels or quotas. It reflects a shift in priorities, a move towards pursuing national strategy over collective coordination at a time when coordination is needed the most. And that inevitably places greater responsibility on Saudi Arabia, which remains the central pillar of OPEC, to hold the system together and maintain some degree of balance in an increasingly volatile market. Because the reality tonight is this: the Gulf is not just dealing with external pressure from conflict, it is also navigating internal divergence. And in moments like these, leadership really matters. So the question tonight is not just what happens between Washington and Tehran, it is what happens within the Gulf itself. Whether the region continues to act with a degree of coordination or begins to move in different directions at a time when the global market is already under strain. On the surface, the story is about stalled diplomacy. But beneath that, a second story is taking shape. A test of whether the system that once helped stabilize oil markets, which was of course anchored by Saudi leadership, can continue to hold even as pressures mount from both inside and outside. And that is what we are going to focus on tonight. Not just the conflict itself, but the consequences of that conflict for oil, for the Gulf, and for countries like ours that depend on stability in both. And a little later in the show, I will take you through this in detail, what the UAE's exit from OPEC really means, how it changes the balance inside the group, and why it could mark a turning point in how global oil markets are shaped going forward. So let's start. To dive deeper into the story, we are now joined from Delaware, USA, by Dr. Gregory Gause. He is the Associate Fellow, Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and also Professor Emeritus of International Affairs, Bush School of Government and Public Service, Texas A&M University. Dr. Gause, welcome to our show.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
So I know that you've done a lot of work also in the Middle East, which makes it very useful and appropriate for us to now dive into this latest development which has happened in the Middle East. I'm talking, of course, about the UAE opting out of OPEC. Now there is an economic dimension to that in terms of what happens to OPEC and what happens to international oil prices. But there is a political angle to it also, with the UAE now breaking ranks with Saudi Arabia. So let's first start with the political angle. What do you think is the most significant aspect of UAE taking such a huge decision?
I think it's the timing. The officials in the Emirates had talked for some time about the constraints they felt being in OPEC, the quotas imposed. But to announce the withdrawal in the midst of the Gulf crisis, before this war is over, and I think we have to say the war continues on, even though there's a ceasefire in the actual firing of missiles and drones, because there's no political settlement yet. The timing of this at a time when all of the Gulf states came under attack from Iran, and they had presented, at least to some extent, a united front in opposition to Iran. For the Emirates to announce the withdrawal from OPEC, which is a direct challenge to Saudi Arabia, because if you were in OPEC, it meant that you acknowledged that Saudi Arabia was the leader of the oil producers, and for the Emirates to do this at this time, I think sends a clear signal of a rejection of Saudi leadership in general.
And this rejection, of course, can have so many consequences. We are looking at a conflict which is still very much on, as you said. And it's hard to say where it will go. We do know that the Iranians are expected to come out with another peace proposal, which will be routed through Pakistan once more to Washington. And we don't know what the reaction would be from President Trump, but clearly at some point there will be a deal. That's safe to assume. We don't know what it will take. But once this conflict comes to end, the geopolitical map of the Gulf is going to be changed, as you just said. Now, Dr. Gause, Pakistan was never a major player in the Gulf. It was primarily restricted to South Asia. But in this conflict, we've seen Pakistan playing a very active, in fact, a leading role in the affairs of the Gulf and West Asia. And we also have now a defense pact with Saudi Arabia. So when you look at the post-conflict political dynamics of the Gulf region, what stands out?
So I think that what stands out to me, first and foremost, is a big question mark, and that question mark is where Iran goes. The purpose of this war, from the Israeli and American perspective, to be completely frank about it, it was to change the regime in Iran, and that has not happened. Where the Iranian regime goes, in a more hardline direction, in a more conflictual direction, or whether after this war ends, its own internal problems and contradictions force it to take a more modest stance, is, I think, the biggest question. But the other question, as we talked about earlier, is where do the Gulf countries go? Even though they were all subject to Iranian attack here, and even though they had all taken a roughly similar position in this war, it appears that the Gulf states are going to go in different directions. The Emiratis have doubled down on their relationship with Israel during this war. The Saudis never joined the Abraham Accords and have been reluctant in recent years as a result of the Gaza war and Israeli involvement in Lebanon and Syria to move toward the Israelis. You have the Omanis keeping a very open channel to Iran, whereas the Emirates and Bahrain very critical of Iran. And it does seem like whatever unity there was in the Gulf in confronting this war is beginning to fragment.
This fragmentation is already happening, as you said, and most likely it will solidify once the conflict ends, and we'll have very clear blocks, and those blocks will have their own perceptions or own policies of their security architecture, and that's going to be a big, huge change happening there. Of course, as you said, Iran will play a major role depending on what shape it takes, and as far as we can see, Iran is holding out very well and forcing the Americans to try and find some sort of a compromise. Talking about peace at this stage, I'll circle back to the Gulf politics, Dr. Gause. Speaking about where we are right now and where you are in the US, the impact of the war is currently being felt at the gas station. But is that enough for the White House to try and speed up this deal making? Or do you think they will play for time and feel that time is actually on their side and not on Iran's side?
So I think it's difficult to anticipate what the United States is going to do, because the decision-making here is all in the hands of one person, and that's President Trump. And he has played this whole crisis as a day-to-day improvisation. I don't think that there's a long-term strategy here. I think that once the initial attacks from Israel and the U.S. failed to achieve regime change or surrender from Iran, it became really, as I said, an improvisation, a day-to-day experiment for President Trump. I think that in general, the political forces here are pushing for an earlier rather than a later end to this crisis. Anything that gets energy moving out of the Gulf would help President Trump as he and his party face midterm elections in November that at least the polls say are not looking good for them. So I think that there is pressure politically for a quick solution on the Strait of Hormuz, but President Trump is he will do whatever he thinks is best for him day to day, and that could change in a moment.
Of course, we are reading reports that he's telling the military high command to prepare for a very long blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and that could possibly work in terms of putting pressure on Iran. But we also see that Iran is now ready to absorb a lot of pain, and it is also an existential crisis for them, at least for the regime. So when it comes to who can absorb the pain, it seems like the Americans may once again be in for a surprise.
I think you put your finger on the issue, and that is that for the Iranian regime, this is an existential crisis. They understand that the Americans and the Israelis were coming after the regime as a whole, and they can't come out of this war looking weak, and thus they're going to attempt to claim victory, and victory goes beyond just staying in power for them. They have to be able to say that they've bested the United States, and so that will give them an enormous incentive, despite the pain that this war is and this blockade is causing for the Iranian economy and the Iranian people. They will have a lot of incentive to stick to their guns. And as I said, it's so difficult to anticipate President Trump. President Trump, he can turn 180 degrees in one day. He can talk about destroying the Iranian civilization one day, and the next day extend a ceasefire and talk about a deal that will make Iran great again. So we're in a position where the biggest player in this game is also the most unpredictable.
And one reason for that possibly is that the situation as it stands now is not what perhaps a lot of people in the White House thought would be. There's a lack of planning. We've seen stories reported in papers like the New York Times about how what the planning that went into, or the assumptions that went into the planning for this war, and many of them have turned out to be rather inaccurate. And the fact that the whole perception of the US providing a security umbrella to the Gulf states is now also under question, which basically now brings me back to where we started from, Dr. Gause. When we're looking at the security architecture of the Gulf in the coming days, and a demand of obviously from Iran that the US its bases, which obviously is not realistic, but the fact that a lot of Gulf countries now realize that the US bases turned out to be more of a liability than a source of protection. And of course we've talked about the UAE also breaking ranks with Saudi Arabia. So are we looking at a fragmented security architecture in the Gulf, with Americans playing a role to an extent, but not as large as it was before the conflict, the Chinese and the Russians coming in to fill in the vacuum, and countries like Pakistan, who've already had a defense pact with the Saudi Arabia, and maybe other countries there are also exploring similar things. So basically, are we looking at a fragmented kind of a security architecture which would be very different from what it was before the war started?
I don't think very different. All the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, are caught in a vice. They're caught in a difficult situation. They really don't have an alternative to the American security link. The Chinese are not willing to provide that kind of defense support. The Russians, I don't believe, can provide that. I think all of the Gulf countries are going to be looking to develop the resilience of their defenses, and that means going to East Asia, going to Europe, but that doesn't mean rejecting the core American security commitment that they've all made. And to some extent, at least on the technological side, the air defense systems in the Gulf states worked pretty well. Well over 90% of the Iranian missiles and drones were intercepted. That not perfect, and there was serious damage in some of the Gulf states. But I don't think that the bases were the reason that Iran targeted the Gulf states. They targeted every Gulf state, whether there were American troops there or not. They targeted civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure. The Iranian strategy here was to cause maximum pain in an effort to put global pressure on the U.S. to end the war. And so I don't think that any of the Gulf states are going to completely reject the American military presence, and the Emiratis have already said that they're going to increase their ties to the United States and to Israel. So I think that what we'll see in the longer run is an effort by all the Gulf states to develop, if you will, secondary backup defense strategies that could involve regional states like Pakistan, that could involve China, that could involve East Asian states, and could involve the European Union states. But I don't think that means a move away from the United States.
What kind of a grouping are we looking at, Dr. Gause, when this happens? And I say that in the context of the very important role played by middle power. I mentioned Pakistan, of course, in terms of the diplomatic role that it played and continues to play. We also know that countries like Turkey and Egypt have played very key roles in all of this. They are big countries, powerful and influential countries in the region. Saudi Arabia, of course, remains amongst the Gulf countries the largest and by far the richest country. So, and UAE breaking away from this Saudi alliance. So what kind of groupings are we looking at? We know that the UAE is now drawing closer to Israel and to the US. So how does this region then divide into various power blocks?
So I think that we have to understand that this notion of blocks can be very flexible in the Middle East. What appears to be a solid alliance can break apart. I think that this is a very transactional region. Just a few years ago, the Turks and the Saudis were at daggers drawn, and now Turkey and Saudi Arabia seem to be cooperating much more closely. I think that less than 3 years ago, the Emirates and Saudi Arabia were proclaiming that they had a relationship closer than any other, a very special relationship, and now they see things very differently. I think that we have to understand that this is a very fluid area, and that a lot of the efforts to reach out to extra regional and middle powers made by the Gulf states are to increase their choices, not to change their fundamental direction. I think that what we're going to see in the wake of this war will depend enormously on where Iran goes, and I think all of the players involved are going to maintain the ability to hedge. They're going to maintain strategic choices. They're going to be fluid in the way that they deal with their security partners. I don't see firm and established blocks coming out of this. In fact, I see more fluidity.
Based on all of this, finally, Dr. Gause, in this very program earlier this month, I spoke with Dr. Mersheimer, and then I also spoke with Dr. Robert Pape. Both of them have been very vocal in their analysis of this war. And both of them agreed that after this war, Iran is going to emerge as a major power, completely opposite to what the Americans wanted. Would you also agree with this assessment?
Yeah, Professors Mearsheimer and Pape, for whom I have great respect, the Chicago boys, I think that they are on to something. Iran has sought, through its nuclear program, to develop a serious deterrent tool, a serious deterrent weapon. But what we've found is that they've always had that deterrent weapon, and that's the closing of the strait. And they did it much more easily, I think, than most people thought they would. And they did it much more precisely, allowing their own shipping through, stopping other shipping. That proved to be a real surprise. However, the Iranians have real problems as well. And that's why I don't think that they emerge that much stronger from this war. You'll recall that over the past, I'd say, 8 years, the Iranian people have risen up in various degrees against their government 3 times. And most seriously, just before this war. That's one of the reasons why the Trump administration thought that they could overthrow the regime with an air war. And the economic costs of this war we will see will be felt in the Iranian population going forward. And after this war is over, not during it, but after this war is over, we'll have to see how this government, a more hardline government, deals with a mobilized population that is increasingly unsatisfied with their lot, with their economic situation, and with the way the government handles the economy. That is the Achilles heel of the Iranian regime.
Very well said. Dr. Gregory Gause, such a pleasure to have you with us and hear your analysis. Thank you for joining.